to Jyoti. Go ahead, Jyoti, and go ahead and share your screen.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. Can you hear me, Tom?
Yes.
Super. Well, thank you for inviting me to give this talk. And as you said, why on earth would you invite somebody who's neither a missiologist or a theologian to talk about whether the church should get involved in something? And I was thinking about it, that I'm going to talk about something that I feel passionately about. I'm engaging on this issue in my professional life, and um, and so perhaps as a Christian, I should be reflecting on what it is that motivates me. It's we read in in Paul's writings, he says it's the love of Christ that compels me, and that would be an easy thing to say, but maybe there are lots of other good reasons that I could pick on for why I would want to be sharing about these issues. And yet there was another part of me that said, well, why would anybody care anyway? I mean, you don't bring any kind of a qualification on these subjects. So why not just forget about adding in, a Bible verse here or there just to show that I'm a Christian? But instead, what I want to do, Tom, is that I want to present the kind of issues that I discuss with my business and work colleagues, the peers I engage with, the people I come across. And I want to present those ideas and then ask you and the folks who are in this call, should the church get involved? So in a sense, I'm going to walk away from the challenge of answering the question of should the church get involved in climate, biodiversity, and inequality. And I'm just going to provide some context that I hope will be helpful in getting the conversation going in the church community about whether the church should or not be involved in these issues. As background, my name is Jyoti Banerjee, as Tom said, and I've been an entrepreneur in the tech sector. I've been involved in impact investing, investing in businesses run by Christians who are bringing a kingdom perspective to their investments. I've been involved in exploring how large corporate organizations can change their reporting practices. And so I was part of the integrated reporting movement that now has probably around 2,000 listed companies around the world using a framework for more holistic reporting. And yet, through all of that, I felt actually we keep facing some very serious systemic issues that prevent significant change from happening. And so what I want to share with you is the thinking that I've been doing over the last few months. I've been engaging with a whole number of friends, some of whom are on this call, like Peter Harris and Paul Massara. And I want to share with you where I've got to in my thinking, partly to hope, in the hope that I can gain something back and learn about ways in which these ideas can continue to develop, but also because I'm hopeful that we can start a conversation about what the church's response to these issues might look like. So I'm going to start moving the slides, and I hope, does the slide move on, Tom? Yeah, okay. So I'm going to start here. We are in a COVID crisis right now. And I was really struck by this this article that Kim Stanley Robinson, who's a fiction writer, put into the New Yorker. And he said, the virus is rewriting our imaginations. What felt impossible has become thinkable. The virus is rewriting our imaginations. And in a real sense, I felt absolutely yes. There are things that are happening out there which, if we had thought about it, should we do online church? I don't know what your church is like, but in my church, that would probably have required, a year-long round of meetings with the PCC before we decided that it's perhaps something we should explore. And yet we've done it in just a snapshot. It's happened just like that, and it's exciting to see that. My wife is a school teacher, and her entire school has moved online, and it's amazing to see how all of that has happened just in a flash. And yet we're also asking the question: so when we go back to normal, whatever normal looks like, do we learn from this? Do we bring these ideas back in? Maybe we should think about new things. And so I like this idea that the virus is rewriting our imaginations, because it's allowing us to imagine whole new ideas and how things can work. There's also this statement that I really like from Milton Friedman. He's not someone I'm actually a fan of, because he can be held responsible for much of the thinking that has dominated our economic systems over the last 50 years. But he did say this: only a crisis produces real change. And when that crisis occurs, the actions that are taken depend on the ideas that are lying around. And I feel, well, we do have a crisis. We've got a crisis because lives and livelihoods are being lost across the world in an almost unprecedented way. Governments are are acting on this stuff. I saw a figure that said something like $8 trillion have been released by governments to kind of deal with the economic after effects of this crisis, and yet we also see that we're probably still coming close to collapse. And if this is the situation with the virus, actually, what happens when the climate crisis hits us? Because the virus is going to be gone maybe next year or the year after, when they found something to mitigate its effects. But what happens with climate? Climate's not going away. It's going to be there for the next 20, 30, 40, 50, 100 years. How do we deal with that? What preparation do we need to take within our global systems? What about the church? How does the church prepare for this? Now, I'm going to start with this particular picture. I don't know if any of you have seen it. And I know I could probably discuss the Palladian architecture of the building that is in the background there. But this 200-year-old building is in this particular situation, was in this particular situation last night. This is a picture from last night of the White House. A Reuters photographer took this picture. This doesn't look like the residence of the most powerful man in the Western world right now, when you look at it in this way. And I wonder if actually what we are seeing in some way, and I don't want to talk about the politics of this, but I do wonder if what we're seeing is the anger, the hurt, the frustration when you have 100,000 people dying from a pandemic. You have 40 million people unemployed over the last 3 months. You have racial inequality, racial tensions, social inequalities that have stretched for decades, maybe even a couple of centuries. And you mix all of that together, and here we have a picture that is a startling reminder that the politicians don't always know how to deal with the situation that we face. And that is perhaps an unfortunate context, but it's something that I think we ought to be mindful of, even when we explore issues like climate, biodiversity, and inequality. So, what might happen on climate? And we hear lots of things, the scientists keep telling us about what might happen. And I've just put a few of these ideas down on this particular slide, and I'll read them for you, for those of you who are not following the screen. But we're going to have a situation where currently we have about a third of the planet lacks sufficient water for at least 1 month every year. We're going to get to the point by 2050 where half the planet, more than half the planet, is in that situation. We're going to see rising seas would get us to the point where about 750 million people who live in coastal cities, and by that I also mean London, will have to flee their homes at a cost of around $1 trillion each year by 2050. Okay, we're talking something that's not next century, it's 30 years down the track, is what scientists are telling us. We are already in a situation where 1 in 4 species of life on Earth are facing extinction. That number continues to grow. And we have got other things that the climate scientists are talking about as tipping points, which is what happens when the Arctic ice melts. Actually, a load of other things happen, which are really, really unfortunate, and they're very difficult for all of us. And so the scientists are talking about tipping points that push the system into worse and worse positions. So climate scientist Tim Lenton, who's at the Global Systems Institute at the University of Exeter, he is saying that he is expecting around 1 billion, that's 1 billion climate refugees for every 1 degree centigrade rise in global temperatures. And from where we are today, the expectation of the United Nations Environmental Programme is that we are currently at around 1.1 degrees of warming since the dawn of the industrial age, and we will get to around 3.2 degrees in the next 30 years. So just on that count, we're talking about around 2 billion climate refugees that will be displaced from their homes over 30 years. This isn't something that will happen in some faraway land, like the Marshall Islands will get devastated and therefore their people will have to go somewhere. Yeah, that will certainly happen. But the other question is, where will they go? And so I think these are issues that are, like COVID. It's not something that is going to pick by geography. It's just going to be something that will happen to all of us. When we know all of this, and we know what the impacts of all these things can be, and the fact is that climate change and biodiversity loss and inequality are actually deeply interrelated. The people who will suffer the most from climate change will be the people from whom the natural resources that are available to them get taken away. And they are often the poorest people on planet Earth. And so we intensify the cycles that they're in when we explore these issues. So my question is, when we know so much about what's going to happen, and by the way, the picture that I put up there has got shows the data on carbon emissions. So carbon is just one of the many, many, many issues that we're talking about. Climate scientists track over 400 issues in their discussions, but carbon is kind of the headline issue for many people. And if you look at that, the NASA data shows that we've had carbon levels fluctuating up and down for the last million years. And yet now, all of a sudden, we hit the top figure in 1950 that has happened over the last million years, and we've just skyrocketed up from that over the last 70 years. So we are doing stuff that is taking us into really, really bad places. And it's not as if nothing is being done, because across the world there are thousands of initiatives that are seeking to have an impact in these issues, and yet you got to ask the question: show me where those initiatives are on the carbon emissions chart. Which bit of the carbon emissions chart is tailing off because we now have these successful emissions? And I got to say, the answer is, we can't see the evidence of all the work that we're doing when it comes to that sort of a chart. So why is that? I've got a hypothesis for you. The human system that's draped across planet Earth is actually a collection of interconnected systems. And these systems are very tightly woven together across the planet. And it's because they're tightly woven together, even if we see a change in one part of the system, it doesn't necessarily flow out across the rest of the system. And so perhaps we're at this stage where we got to ask the question: is there a way in which we can see change take place? And of course, we have huge numbers of barriers to the way in which change could take place. And the barriers are that, for one thing, we just assume that we got to have an economy that grows, because growth is at the heart of pretty much every political project around the world. And without that growth, we can't actually deal with quite a few of the issues that we have in our economics. And yet, if we continue to grow at these levels, we haven't found a way to do so without also causing deep, deep harm to the planet and our human systems. So we have this assumption that we can just keep growing. For people who can act, quite often the things that are right in a public context aren't necessarily the things they want to do in a private context because their decision making is driven by a different machine. Their assumptions are different. They fear the competition will eat their lunch while they're busy doing the right thing. And so we end up with a number of obstacles. And on the chart, I've laid out perhaps 8 different ones, and we could have a big discussion about all of them. But I want to just quickly continue with this because I want to get us to a different place. I want to ask the question, is there anything we can do about it? And for me, in the conversations I've been having with friends and colleagues, one thing that kept coming up is this question that the scientists talk about, which is the idea of a tipping point. Climate scientists use the language of tipping point when they want to talk about a tiny change that happens in one part of the system, but it has huge impacts across the working of the system. So this particular picture that's on the screen comes from Nature magazine, and Tim Lenton and his team at Exeter and other places, they were talking about the fact that when you have droughts in the Amazon and then you have melting of the ice in the Arctic. It has huge effects on circulation in the Atlantic, and then that has huge other effects. And the permafrost starts thawing across Siberia, and all of these things, each one of them pushes the whole system into a worse place. And that's because our entire physical system is so deeply interconnected. But I wanted to ask the question, because we have a deeply interconnected human system, a human economic social system, could it be possible that we could have some changes happen, which are perhaps not such huge changes, but they're small changes, but they have tipping effects and they force the whole entire system into new places? And can these new places be good places to go to rather than the bad places that that the scientists are talking about when we see tipping change in our physical systems? And that particular idea is one that I've been exploring for some time. So let me give you an example just to place this in context. Look at the US. The US is regarded as the world's breadbasket. And the US farmers believe they feed the world, which in many ways they do. And yet, we have a complete crisis in agriculture in the US at the moment because of the way agriculture is done in the US, a kind of chemical, genetically modified approach to agriculture. Right now, the US is losing about 1 billion metric tons of soil through erosion every year. The water, the dirt is no longer acting as an infrastructure to be soil. It's just dirt with a bunch of chemicals in it. And that doesn't hold water. We're losing 1 billion tons of soil. Now, that's perhaps part of the reason why we have more US farmers going bankrupt at the moment than we've seen in a long time. Certainly over the last decade, we're at the highest level. And we have the fact that US agriculture has social and environmental costs of around $85 billion annually. This is supposed to be the breadbasket of the world. How do we deal with this? How do we actually change this? Now, I've had some amazing conversations over the last few months, and I want to introduce you to Bob Quinn. Bob Quinn is a Montana farmer who had his grandparents started a farm in Montana in 1920, 6 years after the very first Montana farm. And Bob Quinn wanted to move away from standardized chemical agriculture, as he calls it. And he said it was a real challenge because the system around him assumed that he would use genetically modified seeds. And those genetically modified seeds needed a certain regime of pesticides and a certain regime of fertilizer for the soil, chemical fertilizers for the soil. And it needed tilling by huge machines that just go and break up the soil and tear them up or tear the soils up all the time. He wanted to do life differently on his farm. And he found that actually the insurance company wouldn't insure him for doing farming in the non-standardized way. So everything about how the system worked stood against him in doing this, and yet he decided he wanted to go ahead and head towards organic farming. At the same time, I was having a conversation with the folks at Horizon. Horizon is the largest organic dairy brand in the United States, and it's owned by a French company, Danone. And Danone has a very strong environmental stance. And one of the things that they've decided they're going to do is they're going to be carbon positive by 2025. So they've only got 5 more years left to do it. And Horizon needs to move in this direction to enable Danone to achieve its goals. And Horizon realizes that they can't do this on their own. They need the farmers they work with to move. And so they've got 600 farmers that they work with, and they want to move them into a place where they could be managing their soils properly and so on, and doing the right things. And Danone has put together a fund to enable this to happen. And while I was talking to Horizon, there's also this conversation with Microsoft. Now, Microsoft's got nothing to do with agriculture, right? We all know Microsoft is a tech company. And yet Microsoft has decided that it's going to be carbon negative. They use different language. While Horizon says carbon positive, Microsoft says carbon negative, and I think they both mean the same thing, which is that they're not going to be using carbon in net terms. By 2030, it's going to be carbon negative. By 2050, Microsoft is going to have taken back all the carbon it has ever emitted into the atmosphere since 1975, when it was founded. This is the ambition of this tech company. But for them to do it, they actually need to use soil as a way of sequestering carbon, because the other way they can do it is to direct air capture carbon from the soil. And the technologies just aren't there as yet. And sure, the investments of companies like Microsoft in that sort of area will help change things, but it's not there yet. So somehow we need to find a way in which the Bob Quinns of this world working on the ground, the Horizons of this world who are selling agricultural products into the market, the Microsofts of this world who are not agricultural companies at all, but who would benefit from a huge change in the way agriculture is done. We need to get the insurance company into play, because we need them to realize that actually they shouldn't be insuring companies to do the standardized agriculture, the chemical stuff. They should be helping farmers move into this new model. And maybe for farmers who, when they move into this model, they find that it's going to take them some years to get their soil back into play. Who's going to fund that? Maybe we need financial institutions. We really need not just the agriculture sector to worry about agriculture. We need all of us to be involved in some way. And how would we do that? And so I want to very quickly walk you through some of the ideas we've been exploring, which is, are there tools that will help us think about facilitating change in this way? Is it possible to even imagine new ways of thinking that would allow us to head in this direction? And we got to ask the question, who really should be playing in these conversations? Just as in the same way out here, I pointed to the fact that it's not just the agriculture community that's going to solve agriculture. We need to get the Microsofts and the insurance company and the finance companies and the customers who want to buy the outputs from these farms and so on. We need to get them all engaged. Who is it that gets to play in this? And if we did all these things, would it actually change the system? And so I want to very quickly explore some tools that can be used just to show that perhaps it is possible to think in different ways. So I'm going to point you in the direction of 3 different tools that we think are pretty helpful in this context. And the first one is the Cynefin framework, and that's a good old Welsh word. It was in 2007 that an article on this was published in Harvard Business Review. But it was really asking the question, if you have a particular kind of problem, the solution to that problem depends on the kind of problem that you have. And what solutions should you use? And we're very good when we have problems that are on the left side of the screen, which is problems where we know these problems can be solved because other people solved them. They're known problems. Knowable problems are problems where We may not know the answer, but we know that there are experts who, if they get their heads together, they can go and sort these problems out. Our issue is that really in this complex system that we live in, the complex adaptive system that we live in, we can't just use experts from one area to solve our problems across this thing. It would be like expecting an agriculturalist to come along and sort out how insurance should be done in the agriculture sector. It can't be done because the insurance company is going to say, wait a minute, that's not how we do things. So we need to find new ways where we allow these conversations to emerge. And this is what in the Kunavan framework is known as emergent practice, where we develop the narratives across the different participants so that we can see what makes sense for everyone who's participating in this. So that's one kind of problem. The second one is who actually can do something about this. And for me, I find it interesting to ask the question, should we as individuals get involved? What if we just did our bit? We're seeing a lot of people, especially in church communities, talking about plastic. Let's reduce our use of plastic and then we'll let everybody else worry about themselves. And hopefully our little contribution will be enough. And that's great. But on its own, it doesn't change how the system works. And we only really get to see change happening in systems when individuals can collaborate together and bring some collective force, a collective imperative to the actions that they're interested in. And not just about everyday things like, what's in fashion today, but about really deeply strategic issues. So, for example, Theresa May's government, who seemed to be in paralysis over the Brexit issue, they didn't seem to be able to talk about anything else. And yet, one of the last pieces of legislation that her government was involved in putting together was the stuff around the UK being carbon neutral by 2050. So that's now in the statute books. How did that happen? Because there were actions happening on the street where thousands and hundreds of thousands of people were on the street saying, we want to see something happen on this. And so even a government that was paralyzed in all other respects still found the means to go ahead and do something on this. So when people get together and act, we can see change. Who are the people who can change? Of course, it could be governments. Businesses can cause huge amounts of change. You know that the top 2,000 businesses in the world account for around 42% of the impacts of everything that we see happen around us. 2,000 companies, just 2,000 companies. So you can actually memorize the names of all of them. And they account for more than 2/5 of the impacts that we see around us. Financial institutions, what about them? Well, they account for around $90 trillion of the overall global system, which has about $900 trillion of financial resources floating around. So these financial institutions can do something. Maybe we should engage the media or ask the academics to sort things out. And yet when I talk to the academics, they tell me, you know what, we've been working on this for 30 years. Speaking to a leading climate scientist who said, I've been working on this for 30 years, and I assumed that if I just shared all my findings with policymakers, they would act on it. And he says, I realize that's just not going to be the case. So who is it who can actually create change? And for me, I feel it's got to be a collective. It's got to be all of us working together, recognizing that each of us plays our part in this. And then the third tool I want to just share with you before I get to the end is that perhaps we can imagine that systems can change. One good reason for people not doing stuff is because they say, but nothing will change. We just can't see any change happen. And yet we have seen change happen. We have seen the entire global system move from being powered by steam to being powered by oil. Something changed at some point. And the way it happened, I found the Berkana Institute two loops model really interesting, because the top loop is saying, we have a system. It's working really well. It develops and develops and develops and grows. And at some point, people realize, wait a minute, it just can't keep going like this. the system is going to come to an end. And so then they start dropping out of the system and they go and do their own thing. And so right now we've got farmers who are buying a little plot of land on the edge of a desert in Latin America, and they're doing agriculture in a new way. But that doesn't change the system. They're just doing their little thing. But what if these people can find each other and connect and start doing things at scale? What if we can nourish whole communities of practice around these ideas? What if we could get the Bob Quinns and the Horizons and the Microsofts and the insurance companies and the finance companies and the water companies and the groceries to collaborate together to create a new community of practice around what this new model of agriculture could look like? What if? And then that could be powerful enough and strong enough for people to join it from the old system. And that's where the transition can take place. And I put in on the slide, it says, we will not discover system-wide solutions by seeking incremental improvements which leave the whole unchanged. Because I don't think we're about getting to doing things, 10% better or 20% better. This has got to be about imagineering a newly transformed system. I love the word Imagineer. I first came across it when I visited Disney for the first time, where they closed this particular attraction, the one part of the Disney place, because they were Imagineering what it was going to look like. And I think what they meant by that was they were going to imagine a new attraction and they were going to engineer it. And that's sort of where we're at. So I'm actually going to skip this just because this is stuff to do more with where are we in this. I want to encourage what I'm calling the North Star transition, which is we want to transit from the old system to the new system, and we need a new North Star that will help us do it. We need a new direction of travel that will take us into a new place, and I'm calling that the North Star. And if any of you are interested in these ideas, I'd love to discuss them further with you later on. But I want to point to this, which is that tipping change works across the entire human system. So if we want to change food systems, yeah, let's do it. But we got to accept that a change in one bit of the system will involve, implicate, and require change in the other parts of the system as well. And that's how our whole human social economic system works. So what is our vision? Where do we come into this? And when I say we, I don't just mean the businesses I might engage with, or the academics, or the policymakers, or the financiers, or any of those. I also mean us as the church. And in order to help the conversation for the next few minutes, I want to ask these questions. And these are the questions that I was prompted with when I was asking the question, should the church get involved in these issues? And I've separated the questions out into three parts. As Christians, do we have any agency as individuals? Is that stuff that we should be doing as individuals? Or is this just too huge a system to deal with? And therefore, we just go and do our little quiet thing on Sundays and we don't engage on these issues. What is our role as individuals in this? How does our individual faith speak into, can it even change the behavior of the system around us? And because we're Christians, we know that actually, if we want to change things, that change starts with individuals, with us. And so I want to ask the question, can we really see systemic renewal without personal renewal? What about church communities? As congregations, can we use our collective actions in a way to show that there's actually a better way of working, whether it's dealing with environmental issues or whether it's dealing with social impacts, inequalities, as communities working together? What can we show as a different way to others? How do we prepare to help our society face the crises that are coming? Because these crises are coming, whether it is the physical crises caused by the environmental issues, or whether it's biodiversity crises that will impact all sorts of things about how our human system works and how our agriculture system works. We should also ask the question, who is our neighbor? Who is it that we think we should be engaging with and helping? What does that mean? And then for the church as a whole, I want to ask this question. What's our vision of human flourishing? Are we the people who have a vision? One of the things that's been really interesting to me about going out and talking to businesses and so on about these issues is how many people would really like to see change happen. But the change they're seeking is somehow or the other, we can progress to a point where we solve all these problems. And their vision looks remarkably like the kingdom of God on earth, with one small difference. They're not interested in the king. They want the kingdom without the king. What is our vision of human flourishing? In fact, what is God's vision? We're only interested in human flourishing because at the end of the day, that's what Jesus said. I'm here so that we can have life and have life more abundantly. So, what is God's vision? Can we share our vision of human flourishing with others to say, come on, people, here's what we think can happen. What does missions look like in a world of climate heating, migration, water shortages? What's our view on missions in the 21st century? And let's also ask the question, if we are the largest NGO in the world, as someone used that language with me yesterday, and they said, we're the largest NGO in the world because we've got a couple of billion people in our organization, the church. How can we take collective kingdom action while bringing the light of the kingdom to individuals who are thirsting for God? So it's recognizing that it's individuals who thirst for God, but recognizing that the kingdom of God invades all the spaces that we're in, including the social, economic, human system that we live in. I'm going to leave you with two quotes. Gus Speth is a US advisor on climate, former US advisor. I'm not sure who the current one is to the president. It says, I used to think that the top environmental problems were biodiversity loss, ecosystem collapse, and climate change. I thought that 30 years of good science could address these problems. I was wrong. The top environmental problems are selfishness, greed, and apathy. To deal with these, we need a cultural and spiritual transformation, and we scientists don't know how to do that. And Martin Luther King, he said, most times the way isn't clear, but you want to start anyway. It's in starting with the first step that other steps become clearer. Tom, thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to share my thoughts, and I'm looking forward to the questions that come out of this.
Well, Jyoti, that was an excellent introduction to the future of mission. And again, if you want to make a comment or ask a question of Jyoti, then go down to your participant screen and push the little button that says raise hand, and it'll immediately flag me that you're interested in the question. Jyoti, what are your thoughts? And, you know, it's interesting you started out with Milton Friedman and the whole thing of a good crisis. I always think of that always use a good crisis for your greatest advantage. But, you know, we're right in the middle of one of the most major crises I've seen in my lifetime, with a whole economy, a whole framework being, and a whole system of doing things brought to a crashing halt because of this disease. What opportunities are you seeing in terms of people thinking about selfishness, greed, consumption, in light of some of the events that we're going through right now?
Well, it's been fascinating to hear stories from across the world of how people are hearing birds chirping in the trees in the morning because our planes aren't flying at the moment. We've got over the last month or so in Britain, we've had zero coal powering our systems, and that's partly because we haven't consumed as much. You know, our offices are not buzzing. They're not using energy, so our and energy consumption levels are lower. But it's enabled us to see a small picture of what a different world could look like, which is, imagine if we didn't have the pollution in the air that's caused by our machines and so on and so forth. And so there is a question where people could be asking, which is, when we go back to normal, whatever normal looks like, whether that's June or July 2021 or whenever it is that normal comes back, there is language that people are beginning to say about, can we build back better?
Mm.
And I hope that actually we would take that pretty seriously, that we wouldn't go back to just doing the same stuff as we're doing, because it's almost like the things that we would like to have seen, which is the global economy slow down and stop. We would like to have seen these things happen in some way, but we couldn't imagine how it could happen. And now it's happened. So let's take advantage of that. And let's see if there is something that we can do where ideas that previously were just not possible, we can ask. But then there's also the fear that the $8 trillion that has gone into funding the economic response to the collapse that is going to happen is going to dominate our thinking. And therefore, we're simply going to say, oh, well, we can't do it anymore. But I remember seeing the Bill Gates presentation on what we could have done to deal with the virus. And he gave that presentation 5 years ago. And at that point, he was talking about, can governments around the world invest $5 billion to solve the problem about the kind of infections we may face. And nobody did anything about it at the time, because 5 billion, who was going to come up with 5 billion? Well, now we've had to spend 8 trillion. So, maybe we have to ask hard questions about the current time.
Okay, I'm going to turn to David Brunt, and David, you're unmuted, so please go ahead.
All right. Thanks very much for that fascinating presentation. I just really wanted to respond just with my view or answer to your question. Should Christians be bothered and be active in this area? And I think I suppose I'm thinking about your first category, which is the church. And I think you did point out just the breadth of impact of climate change and all of the other issues. And I just sort of like to draw the connection with the traditionally a lot of the church has been concerned with social justice, and I think one bit that we sometimes miss is just the massive impact of social justice that climate change would have. So if the sea levels go up, by a meter, then it's predominantly going to be the poor around the world that will suffer and lose their livelihoods, leave their places to live, etc. And I think sometimes we need to hold the environmental aspects and the social aspects totally together. And I think as Christians, we probably don't realize the social aspects, the social impacts of the impact of climate change. So, and I think that's one good reason biblically why we should be active and get involved.
I can't say more than I agree.
Yep. David, I see your hand raised. Go ahead, David. You're unmuted, I think. Let me unmute you again. Go ahead and click unmute on your screen, David. For some reason, I'm not able to unmute. There it goes. Oh, no. David, can you unmute your screen from your end? There you go. Go ahead, David.
Can you hear me now?
It's hard to hear you because of the microphone, but go ahead.
All right. I'll try with the microphone. It's the sound quality that way. Jyoti, just a comment on the church engagement thing. To answer your question, Tom Wright in his book Surprised by Hope said the church is always most effective when the message is matched by its methods, and least effective when it isn't. So I think we need to work on that and how the church engages at every level in matching what it does environmentally with the message of conservation and renewal that's in Scripture. My question to you is, and this comes from a discussion I had recently with a senior executive in an unnamed Christian NGO, when I said, you travel a lot, are you offsetting your carbon emissions. So we've invested in a scheme that offsets in Madagascar. And I said, have you ever been to see that scheme? Do you know anything about it? And he said, no. So I said, well, how do you know A, your money is being offset, and B, how do you know it's not causing more harm than good by taking away marginal land to plant trees for your organisation?
David, David,
Nobody knows.
David, your microphone is breaking up. So what I'd like you to do is to go to chat and write your question out, and then I will give it to Jyoti to answer. But we can't hear you because your microphone's breaking up. So go to chat, write it out, and then I will ask Jyoti. So I'm going to recognize and unmute Damon. Go ahead, Damon.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yes, you're fine.
Right. Thank you for your lecture. It covers extremely important topics. You mentioned the real problem is not to do with science or technology. The problem is with the human heart and selfishness. And so, say, if there are more Christians who are quite selfless, even that may not solve the problem. I mean, there are a lot of Christians in America. I suppose I trust that most of them are quite selfless. But if the kind of gospel or theology that they hear from the pulpit is really very narrow and is thinking about the life after death all the time, they can be very nice people and selfless people, but they don't see engagement with the present world is very important. Maybe the pastor or minister has been trained in their theological understanding in a certain way, and evangelical has a particular problem with the doctrine of creation. We are quite strong on the doctrine of redemption, but not so strong on the doctrine of creation. A lot of pastors just do not know how to handle life on earth, because we don't have a proper understanding of doctrine of creation and why God has created creation and what is the role of human beings and God's creation in all this relationship with one another, with God. So it's not just a matter of having more selfless Christians, but we need to see the North Star, where we should be going. And that requires a balanced theology, a balance between doctrine of redemption and doctrine of creation. We are redeemed for what? We are redeemed in order to engage God's creation in his original intended manner. So we must bring the two together. For God's sake, bring them together.
Well, Damon, thank you for that. And I think we have a significant group of Christians around the world for whom their understanding of faith is about what is going to happen in the life after. And you're right, these influence the discussions that are had in those churches. But we perhaps, I don't want to get into that discussion, but I would welcome the Tom Harveys and the Paul Bender Samuels of this world who engage with on matters of theology and missiology to ask the question: so what does the theology of the 21st century mission look like? What does missiology look like in this context? Because is it going to be about redemption alone, or do we actually have an expectation that the church is going to have to engage in a context where these other issues have such a heavy role to play? So I would love to see change in the church on this, but I don't think it's just about America. I think for all of us, I'm certainly guilty of sitting in the United Kingdom and probably having access to more resources and consuming more resources than the people who grew up in the city that I grew up in, which is New Delhi, or even, leave New Delhi out, and what about the rest of India? So I think for each of us, there's a challenge ahead, but I think there is a challenge, and you say it well, that theologians and missiologists and so on would have to engage with, which is to get the entire church community, not just the individuals, but the whole church engaged on these issues globally.
Jyoti, David has written out his question, and it says, with companies offsetting, is there enough land available to offset the billions of metric tons of carbon involved? Even biofuels may cost more to produce in energy than energy saved. And then sort of an after quote, Tom Wright, in his Surprised by Hope, says the church is most effective when its methods match its message.
Well, I think David is asking a perfectly reasonable question. If offsetting becomes the only way in which companies who are producing a lot of emissions will be able to deal with those emissions, then I think we're going to be in trouble, because we won't be able to solve the problem. We have to find another way in which the entire system can work. And so, for example, when we look at the agriculture example that I gave you, soil, which is in the place of chemical in the chemical agriculture process, doesn't act as soil. And soil that is not soil but is just dirt with a bunch of chemicals in it doesn't hold carbon. But if we could have soil that is properly becoming into infrastructure, soil infrastructure, and that is, it's a living organism that it takes 10 years perhaps of not doing the standardized agriculture to get farms to that place, then suddenly we could see a vast amount of change in terms of how soil holds carbon. But even then, companies that are expecting to use offsetting, like, for example, let's say Microsoft has had 10 years of putting a carbon price in every investment decision they've made. It's their own choice. Companies aren't expected around the world to put a carbon price, but Microsoft has put a carbon price in for the last 10 years. So they've learned how to make decisions on issues where they will favor a less carbon intensive way of working in the first place. So they don't do this by simply buying some carbon offsets to account for the emissions they cause. They first think about, how can we change how we work so we don't cause the carbon? And it's that kind of thing that will do it. Although, David, I think you come from an industry, which is the airline industry, where it's the one thing we actually don't know how to do without carbon fuels and jet fuels.
We have a comment by Adise from Ethiopia. And Adise says, the 17 SDGs are designed by the scientists to respond to the global climate change with little or no partnership with the faith-based organizations. So can the earth survive in the context of selfishness, greed, and apathy? Many churches are not even aware of the SDGs and what the scientists are saying. SDGs, what is that, Jyoti? Do you know?
So the SDGs were put in place by the United Nations as a way of capturing, it was a replacement for the Millennium Development Goals that were put in place for the millennium, which is, at the millennium, there was a hope that we could banish poverty. And we reached the millennium and realized, oh my goodness, we haven't done that, so we now need something else. And so the Sustainable Development Goals were put in place so that by 2030, we would have abolished poverty. And while we're abolishing poverty, there are a few other issues we want to see take place, about education, women, water, etc. So the understanding was that this wasn't just about poverty, but there were some very specific areas we could be looking at. Adise, you're absolutely right that these issues around the SDGs were conceived without the faith communities involved as they could have been. And when you think that these SDGs are supposed to be what's driving our global system to solve the poverty problem, I've got some serious issues with it. If you leave if you leave relationships out of the SDGs, there's no mention of relationships in the SDGs. So you could be doing the worst things possible to the people around you and still achieving your SDGs if you measure them in a particular way or report on them in a particular way. So for me, that's an issue. The fact that faith isn't mentioned, well, 2 billion Christians, a whole bunch more Muslims, and so on. And why aren't we going to get the faith communities involved in dealing with the SDGs? But for me, the biggest, or not the biggest, but one of the big challenges is that poverty itself is defined in the SDGs as $1.25 for each person per day. And let's face it, that is not really getting past poverty. If we had said it was going to be $5 per day, maybe we'd be getting a bit closer to an economic measure. But at $1.25, that's a really disappointing measure. But it was put in place perhaps as a political thing, which is by 2030 we could get to the point where governments could say, "Hey, we've won on this matter." So I struggle personally with the SDG issue, but I think that the SDGs is perhaps the closest thing we have to something that governments across the world would like to see happen. And maybe it's an opportunity for faith communities to be thinking about how to take their story about human flourishing, not just meeting poverty issues, but human flourishing, to people who couldn't really care about their perspective.
Paul, did you want to ask a question? I saw you pop up there for a second.
No, I was just I was going to really add to some of the comments I think that have been made, if I could. I mean, in terms of the offsetting question, offsetting is never going to get you where you want to get to without a heck of a lot of work to reduce your carbon footprint first. Offsetting is more going to be useful where people, it's that resilient, that residual bit that we're probably going to struggle very hard to get to, or it's going to cost us an awful lot of money. But then I don't think there's going to be a space issue. The question will be, where is that offsetting done? Is it done in the local area to where you are, or is it done in a completely different continent? When I come to the faith issue, and I'm talking, I think in 2 weeks' time, so I don't want to say too much, but I think people must be reading a different gospel than me if they're not thinking that these issues are completely interrelated, and how people cannot care about 200 million people being having to migrate, massive poverty, and massive changes in people's lives, and the most vulnerable in society being impacted. That, if we're not here as a church to be God's, Jesus's hands and feet on the earth, then I don't know what we're here for. And when it comes to missionary work, look, I mean, I think people during COVID have sat there and have said, look at the fear, look at the, people are flocking to Alpha right now, because this is a big disruption in their lives. Well, can you imagine what it's going to be like when we have climate change? And so how are we training people? How are we teaching people? How are we educating pastors to work with people when they go through that climate anxiety? And how are we informing and teaching our spiritual leaders around the theology and around the science, and then allowing them? There's just a massive gap in what we're doing, quite frankly. And it doesn't in any way shape up to the challenge that's ahead of us.
Jyoti, do you want to respond to that?
And no, I think Paul was providing a comment on the other questions, and I'm fully with him on that.
One comment I would make, Jyoti, and this is just something that experienced through one of our dissertations, and this was going forward in terms of a person who is working with artisanal mining, which and I know is having a devastating effect on the planet, and yet for all kinds of very common, hardworking people, it's how they generate enough income to live. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that was trying to address some of the ethical and other issues in terms of fair trade management was fair trade. And one of the things that the thesis brings out is this total breakdown in communications between the West and the fair trade standards and the actual artisanal miners on the ground, and how they were not talking to each other and using different languages and setting up standards that couldn't be followed out. And so that artisanal gold miners just gave up on it. And so the thesis basically came to the point where there's a breakdown. What we have here is a failure to communicate. It seems to me that, and what you're doing, Jyoti, and what North Star is looking at is, and what the church can help is to facilitate conversations. It's not that just all voices are the same. There are specific things that need to be addressed, but how do we nurture conversations, and how do we help people? You know, one of the things that we do in mission is translation. And we listen to people who are trying to talk to each other. And often it's the missionary who comes in between and says, when those people say this, this is what they really mean. And when you say this, this is what they hear. And it seems to me that this is a really important exercise as we go forward in getting because people aren't hearing each other, they're not communicating. It's going into flows of conversations that are breaking down. What do you see in terms of North Star and facilitating conversation between the movers and shakers in these very important areas, but also how to get traction on the ground with people in the churches?
Let me talk about the two things you raised. You first of all talked about fair trade and the potential gaps that emerge between our understanding of what is fair and somebody else's understanding of what is fair, especially if they're at the receiving end of our fairness. I was drawn to this not because of something that I saw with miners, but in the chocolate industry. So in Holland, there's a company called Tony's Chocolate Only, and they've started selling some of their chocolate here in the UK as well. And Tony's Chocolate Only is about a chocolate product that wants to make sure that every farmer who's involved in the Tony's chocolate product has received a fair wage. So that's a fair trade kind of idea. So the fair wage needs to be there. However, Tony's felt that this was not enough to allow two things to happen. So so they want to make sure that the farmers are paid what they call an additional premium. And the additional premium covers a living wage. So that's different from what our interpretation of fair wage might be. It's got to be enough for the farmers to actually be able to live. And secondly, for the kids of the farmers to actually go to school, which is a substantial uplift again, because quite often the kids have to work on the farm just because that's the only way to earn a living. And so Tony's additional premium was saying, look, if you want to have chocolate, it needs to be fair trade, but more. And so they call it Tony's additional premium. And Tony's Chocolate Only chocolate 2 years ago became Holland's #1 chocolate, beating Nestle and Mars, which is quite an achievement for a little chocolate company. And now you can buy those chocolates here in the UK. It's a premium chocolate, but not because it's a premium design or anything like that. It's because it's trying to make sure that the people who are involved get paid. So that's the first element, is that we need to have a conversation about what is actually fair. And what goes into that. And then you ask about how can conversations take place across multiple stakeholder groups, if you like, and how do we create the right context for translating what one person is saying and the other person's hearing, etc. And I think it's a very insightful thing to say that's what missionaries have done for years, to carry out translation. And in many ways, our theologians have also done this translation process between the early church and what the 21st century might be hearing when we read those words in the New Testament or in the Old Testament. And I think for the North Star, that's got to be part of what we do, which is we got to have a conversation that allows these multiple elements to come together. You know, I'm listening to conversations that are happening currently amongst financial institutions, and each of them has their own language. They've got a name for what they're doing, and they think they need to solve their particular problem. And if you are a sovereign wealth fund, you have a particular title for the problem. If you're an insurance company, you have a particular title. And you believe that the only people who can help you are other sovereign wealth funds because they get it. They're just like you. And actually, it turns out they're all having the same conversation, and they could all learn from each other. And it would be even more powerful if we could get Microsoft into that discussion, because Microsoft's also having the carbon discussion. Now, how do we change the conversation that's happening between these silo-ized, disconnected groups of people? How do we bring them together so they can learn each other's language? And then they can say, oh, when you say this, this is what you mean. You know, that's really important because we're trying to do this. And now can we do something together? So in our world, we're calling actions that could be this tiny little action that has this huge potential impact. We're calling them 10x action baskets. Because if we could just create an action basket with a small little action, but that action spills across multiple groups of people, and they can say, oh, okay, I get it. I'm going to do this. And if I do this, that really works for them. And by the way, they think it's a good thing that I'm doing it, and therefore they might do something that works for somebody else, or it works for me. And you know, it's how do we create this kind of positive impact rather than getting into negative cycles? That for me has got to be the exciting thing.
Well, that is an exciting thing. One of the things that we're beginning to get it within our vision is a hub for future mission. And maybe Paul, you want to Paul Bender-Samuel to speak to that, but that's up to you, Paul. But this is a very important thing, to be a connection point, to be a place where we bring conversations from around the globe and get those key stakeholders and listen to each other, to have those conversations that, you know, where they say, when I say this, it sounds like you're hearing this, but then get it clear and then get on the same page. I'm going to turn to Marina, and Marina, you're unmuted. Oh, you were?
Yes. Okay. So, yeah, thank you very much for the presentation. It was very interesting and also very, what would say, you were able to communicate to us so that we are sort of quite involved in imagining what you are talking about. So I hear a lot of words that are being thrown in terms of having conversations, working together with grassroots people, decision-making, key stakeholders, and so on, and whether you are communicating with each other properly or not. So I would like to just throw up what comes up on my reflection on this. The first impression that comes to me is when you talk about development, when you talk about a lesson that need to be learned, when you start thinking about plans for future growth and so on, and you start imagining, do you really look into the people's perspective? Because it may not, I mean, those at the grassroots, I'm not talking about just communicating and saying, this is what I mean, and that is what you mean. It's more about different worldviews as well. It's not just the language and what you mean by words. Because, for example, if you look at, I'm going to go back right into history. This is what I've been doing this day, so please bear with me. When you have the colonial British Empire coming into India and seeing, you know, the indigenous people, their lands, living, their hills and mountains, and then they like living a nomadic life, moving from one place to another. What they see from world view is empty space. This land do not belong to anybody. So they think that it's an empty space and they could take it. But then for the native indigenous people, it's not an empty space. They are allowing the land to rest. So they moved on. They live for some period, for a few years, and then move on to give the land a rest. So it was not considered to be empty space. So what I'm trying to say, it's a different worldview. So who will be benefiting and who will be making the decision? Will it not be the educated people who are having the advantage of having a stabilized life in the end, that we go and take and make use of empty spaces, you know, what you would call the green belt or the green area for ourselves, and then leave the people who are already there to, what did you say, to be left out of whatever we could be gained from that. I don't know whether I'm making sense, yeah, but.
Yeah, Marina, I think you're talking about a really important issue, which is there's a lot of history that we should also be able to learn from, and we need to be able to see how change has happened in different contexts, especially when the change has been forced on people who weren't looking for that change to happen. We kind of live in a more globalized context than when the British came to India, for example, and yet we can do this. We can have the same mistakes as were made a long time ago, and so we need to be careful. And I don't want to suggest in any way that if the North Star was involved in enabling a conversation to happen between people, that somehow it's our ideas that are now going to drive the conversation, because it can never be that way. It's got to be that the conversation that's happening between the people who, the various participants, is going to open up new ways of thinking about what is possible, what can and shouldn't be done, and so on and so forth. What I hope we are bringing is the interest in getting people to connect with others who they may not see as being their natural conversation partner in this sort of thing, or their natural decision partner in this sort of activity. So I hope we bring the ideas as to why they should connect with each other. I hope we bring some of the tools that will allow this connection to happen. But I hope you'll also be praying for people like me who are engaging on these issues across a global context, because this is not just about getting a few people to talk to each other, but it's about seeing how a system can change, seeing how we can see the kingdom of God invading new spaces, but not without the king, but with the king, and bringing that into play. And we don't understand how the kingdom of God works, or at least I certainly don't, but I see the effects of it all over the place. So is there a way in which, when the church acts in these conversations, that it creates a new context for enabling honest conversations, giving conversations, fulfilling conversations, thriving conversations, where in the past perhaps they were exploitative, perhaps they were one-sided. And you're right that education makes a difference in this, but actually, whose education? You know, when the I was listening to this podcast about the Maoris when they were when you can go down to this Maori community, and they tell you the story of their land, and they talk about how they used to live, and then they talk about what the Maori flag looks like, because it has these different colors, and each of these colors is because of what Jesus has done in their lives. You know, the red represents the blood that Jesus shed for them to bring these communities together. And then they talk about, and how do they live, and they want now to they want to live with some of the same skills that they learned, not from the missionaries, but which they learned from their forefathers on how to live. And so it's about bringing together the skills and the knowledge and experience they have through their communities and what that has meant, while also bringing into play the fact that actually the kingdom of God has reached into their lives and is changing their understanding of what is possible. So I don't know how all of this will work out. I certainly have no idea how climate change and biodiversity loss and inequality is going to be addressed. But I guess I feel the challenge that as a Christian, we should be involved in this. We should engage, and not just as individual Christians, but as a church community, and as the church, the global church, we should be exploring how we can bring the kingdom of God into all of this.
Okay, we have Peter Rowan. Go ahead, Peter.
Thanks, Tom. Yeah, I think you probably just answered my question, Jyoti. Thank you for such a stimulating lecture. I'm just connecting with Marina's question and comment, just to ask to you and others, how can we bring into all of this the contribution of the indigenous peoples around the world into this whole area of discussion? Because I think there has been an intentional an engagement with indigenous theological reflection in recent years, and they have connection to place, space, the integrated worldview that we so desperately need. We need to learn from all of that in terms of our ecology, our economics, and our community. But those peoples are still very marginal to these discussions. And I'm just asking, how can we bring that voice, which is so urgently needed, into these spaces of discussion?
Peter, I would say I wouldn't have the first clue, because this is a relatively new journey for me, but I see Peter Harris is on this call, and Peter has spent 30 years engaging with local people around the world. And I'd love to invite Peter, if you feel like you're able to speak to this, because this is such an important issue. So Peter to Peter, is that possible? Can I invite the conversation?
Yeah, let me unmute Peter once I find him on here. Here we go. Peter, you're unmuted.
Yeah.
Oh, not, yeah, okay.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I hear you, Peter, go ahead.
I don't really have any expertise to offer particularly, but I would say from Rocha's experience over the decades with this, a number of things. First of all, I think there's a natural integration within indigenous theology, which it just is there because often in these Christian groups where they've been able to resist a truncated Western missiology and reflect on their own experience of God, the grief at what's happened to their places is a very living thing within their worship and lament and spirituality. And the concerns, as Stella Simiyu, my Kenyan colleague and friend, said, that they live an unmediated relationship to creation, whereas Western people have a mediated relationship. And that unmediated relationship, at its best, it brings a new reading of scripture, because they're closer to the agrarian authors of scripture than contemporary Western people are. And so the resources are all there, and the scripture comes alive, and their experience is very raw. I think it has to be done with great humility, though, because the modes of discourse, the ways of making decisions, the ways of contributing are so different. And I think one of the problems is Western timeframes are so completely different, and Western power structures in dialogue are utterly different. And we really have a lot to unlearn. And so how those things are facilitated, it's really, really challenging. And I can think of many people groups who've felt abandoned, really. The Penan people in Southeast Asia, for example, they had a remarkable initial turning to Christ, but then were faced with the destruction of their traditional lands and abandoned, really, by those who had planted churches. And I think there's a lot of relearning that needs to happen that way. But it's also fair to say that the secular conservation movement is also very, very aware that they have largely imposed a Western secular view of things on communities all around the world. And they're playing catch up very fast, and also approaching this now with real humility. But in terms of methodology, what we did in Arusha was simply respond rather than arriving with answers or solutions. So where we were getting requests, we went and listened, and we expected a very long process and a very painful one as well. And our model has been to see in each place that leadership is taken by those who are from there. We're always asked, what should we do? And we never tell anyone what to do. We just make sure we share the same gospel commitments, and then trust the genius of the Holy Spirit to bring about what communities choose to do in their place and in their community.
Very good, Peter. Thank you very much. Any comment, last comment, Jyoti, before we close?
No, I'm thrilled that to hear the conversation that is taking place, because it gives me hope that we are going to engage as a church community, as Christians, on these issues, which I think are the fundamental issues that all of humanity are facing at the moment. Whether they believe in God or not, we have a perspective that I think they will pay attention to, because it's a pretty desperate situation out there.
Well, thank you, Jyoti, and for an excellent session and a great kickoff to this series. And we look forward to the series coming out. We look for all of you to rejoin us next week, same time in this afternoon slot, so that people from North America and South America and also places of Asia can join us more easily. So with that, we thank you very much. If you had a hard time or were only able to join part of this conversation, write me and I will send the Zoom link so you can go back and listen to this as you have time. So again, thank you very much, Jyoti, and all God's blessings as you go about this important work. And I will end the meeting on that.